At 32,000 feet, the air is thin, cold, and cruel. Engines scream in thinner oxygen. Wings bite harder against lift. And any mistake, mechanical, strategic, or human, becomes fatal in seconds. Captain J.T. Mercer stared out across the horizon, his gloved hand wrapped around the throttle of a fighter most had written off. A warbird, a relic. The last piston-driven machine in a sky now owned by jets. And yet today, it was outpacing a $90 million marvel built to replace it. Behind him, closing in from the southwest, came the howl of a modern interceptor. Twin engines burning through sky at Mach 1.2, armed with radar lock, missiles, and arrogance. The test was simple. The jet would catch him, or he'd escape. No weapons, no support, just a trial of speed, engineering, and faith. Mercer wasn't supposed to win this. Every simulation said so, but simulations had never met Marcus Slipstream Harding. 4 days prior, this very aircraft was grounded, not from damage, but from obsolescence. The intake system couldn't handle modern demands. At high altitudes, it starved the engine of pressure, dropping climb rate by nearly 40%. Pilots called it flying with a hand over your mouth. It struggled to hold 18,000 feet, let alone engage anyone above. That should have been the end. Harding, however, didn't believe in endings. A tech sergeant with 19 years of battlefield experience and a reputation for impossible fixes, he approached the intake not as a limitation, but as an opportunity. He tore the scoop apart, cut away the drag, built a new duct profile from salvaged titanium baffles and heat-treated aluminum skin. No design papers, no factory approval. Just raw intuition and thousands of logged hours with broken machines. The result? An impossible jet intake for a piston aircraft. When Mercer first saw it, he laughed. "What is this, a shark mouth?" Harding shrugged. "More like lungs that learn to breathe in thin air." Now, as the fighter screamed through the stratosphere, Mercer wasn't laughing. He was watching something no one expected, the jet falling back. He toggled the radio. "Control, this is Alpha 5, still airborne, still climbing." The reply came hesitantly. "Say again, Alpha 5. Status of the jet?" Mercer grinned. "Visual contact lost. He's not catching me." Silence followed. In the control tower below, technicians exchanged glances. This wasn't how tests ended. Not with a piston-powered bird breaking every rule of propulsion physics. But Harding's intake didn't follow the rules. Its secret? High-volume directional airflow redirected through a Venturi-enhanced baffle array that maximized oxygen density under speed compression. Translation? More air, better combustion, more thrust, all from a system that wasn't supposed to work at all. Mercer leveled off at 34,000 feet. Engine temp green, RPM stable. Not even a tremor on the gauges. Behind him, the jet vanished over the horizon, low on fuel and answers. He tapped the cowling gently, the way pilots do when words fall short. "Thanks, old girl." But deep down he knew it wasn't just the plane. It was Harding, the man with grease under his nails and blueprints in his head. The mechanic who saw beyond schematics, who got laughed at by engineers and warned by officers, who said, "Let me try it anyway," and changed the game in 72 hours. This wasn't just a performance test. It was a battlefield prophecy, that in the age of billion-dollar jets, a hand-built mod could still rewrite the laws of war. And somewhere on the tarmac, as the jet taxied in with empty tanks and bruised pride, Marcus Harding lit a cigarette, looked at the sky, and said nothing. He didn't have to. The intake had spoken for him. Aircraft are systems of delicate violence, metal built to harness combustion, wings calibrated to dance with death. And among the most sacred, most untouchable parts of that system is the intake. It's not glamorous. It doesn't roar or fire or bank. But without it, an engine is just a sealed coffin. The intake is what breathes life into the machine. And because of that, every manual, every engineer, every doctrine says the same thing: don't mess with it. especially if you're just a mechanic. In the eyes of the brass, intakes were fixed, factory-built, perfected, certified through wind tunnel trials, and signed off by generals with pens thicker than your paycheck. The idea that some field technician, grease on his hands, no engineering degree, no top-level clearance, could improve it? Blasphemy. That's exactly what Tech Sergeant Marcus Harding proposed. In a squadron maintenance tent outside Naples, he walked up to his CO with a sketch scribbled on the back of a ration box. It showed an airflow diverter, a tapering venturi throat, and what looked like hand-cut baffles fitted into the cowling mouth of a P-51. The reaction? Laughter. Is this a cartoon? Harding? You planning to turn a prop fighter into a jet? Intake geometry isn't your sandbox, Sarge. Back to oil filters. Harding didn't argue. He'd heard it before. But what they didn't know was that he'd been tracking engine data from every mission flown by their older aircraft. He saw the same trend: reduced manifold pressure at altitude, loss of acceleration in climbs, thermal stress spikes on long throttle pulls. Every warning light pointed to the same culprit: inefficient intake airflow. On paper, intake designs were optimized. In practice, the realities of battle, heat, altitude, structural warping, even paint chipping inside the duct, meant they degraded fast. And that degradation killed performance. Harding's theory was bold. By reshaping the intake's internal contours, adding a baffle system to stabilize pressure waves, and introducing a scoop lip that adjusted boundary layer separation, he could increase airflow by up to 35% without touching the engine itself. No one believed him. Even if it works, one engineer said, it'll void the structural certs. You can't reroute dynamic pressure like that without destabilizing the cowling. To which Harding replied, what's more dangerous, breaking protocol or flying with a plane that can't climb? Still, the resistance held. Doctrine demanded paperwork, flight certification, stress testing, engineering analysis, all of which took months. The war, Harding argued, didn't have months. It had days, sometimes hours. He didn't wait. Instead, he began after hours. One aircraft, already tagged for depot. Its pilot had written it off as gutless above 15,000 feet. Harding removed the intake scoop. He installed hand-cut vanes using scavenged aluminum from a shot-down enemy wing, re-welded the duct with a homemade jig, shaped the new scoop profile using sheet metal formed over an oil drum. By dawn, the cartoon was real. The modified plane roared back to life. Word spread. Pilots started asking questions. Who worked on that bird? Why is it climbing smoother? What's that weird scoop? Still, leadership dismissed it. Until the jet test, until the $90 million fighter got left in the clouds by a machine it should have torn apart. That's when everyone stopped laughing. Because Harding hadn't just challenged a misconception. He had shattered a sacred rule of aviation, that only factories innovate, and only engineers know better. Turns out, all it took was a mechanic, some scrap metal, and the courage to say, why not? Before the chase, before the intake, before the defiance, there was just a tired fighter and a man who couldn't watch it die. The plane was a late-service P-51 Mustang, tail number 4163L. She had survived 2 tours, 8 emergency landings, and a dozen pilots who cursed and praised her in equal measure. Her frame was solid, her engine serviceable. But something was wrong, something deeper than what the manuals could explain. She couldn't climb. Every flight, her nose would tip upward like she wanted to rise, but the acceleration just wasn't there. At 15,000 feet, the engine would start to wheeze. Not a mechanical failure, but a loss of breath, like a swimmer reaching for air through a straw. By 18,000, she was nearly stalling. Harding noticed. He always noticed. Tech Sgt. Marcus Slipstream Harding wasn't just another wrench-turner. He had a reputation for solving problems no one else would touch, usually with tools no one else would use. Recycled tubing from old coolant systems, Wing skin aluminum reshaped into ducting. Even battlefield scrap, German or American, was fair game. But he wasn't reckless. Every mod he made was backed by notes, pages of pressure readings, fuel-air ratios, and airflow calculations taken during takeoffs, climbs, and dives. He kept a field journal thicker than most officers' manuals, cross-referencing real-world performance with factory projections. And 4163L caught his eye. He watched her missions get shorter, abort rates tick up, performance notes piling up with vague complaints, sluggish climb, engine strain at 12K, unresponsive throttle at altitude. None of it pointed to failure. All of it pointed to decay. In the spring of 1945, as Allied air forces pushed deeper into contested skies, every squadron needed fighters that could climb fast, intercept faster, and stay in the air longer than enemy jets. But 4163L was becoming a liability, and Harding hated waste. He started digging, not into the engine, that was standard spec, but into the airflow. He inspected the intake duct, flashlight in hand, tracing the internal contour with his fingers. Paint flaking, seams warping, the curvature of the scoop showing signs of war stress. Barely noticeable, but deadly at speed. The stock intake was designed for mid-altitude bursts, not high-altitude chases. And over time, its geometry, perfect in wind tunnel theory, became an anchor in combat reality. That's when Harding had the idea. What if the intake didn't have to be fixed? What if it could evolve? He'd studied captured German ducting on high-altitude reconnaissance jets. He remembered the diffuser setups on early experimental aircraft, simple changes that radically redirected airflow under compression. He began sketching, not with precision tools, but grease pencils and workshop chalk. Diverging throats, expansion baffles, scoop lip redesigns, all mapped out in the corners of his maintenance tent. His CO ignored him. Other mechanics rolled their eyes. But Harding kept going, because the bird was gasping, and no one else seemed to care. He approached the pilot of 4163L, a young lieutenant named Harper. "What if I could buy you another 6,000 feet of climb without touching the engine?" Harding asked. Harper raised an eyebrow. "You gonna install a rocket?" "No," Harding said. "Just a better set of lungs." With Harper's quiet blessing, Harding made the first cut. The cowling came off. The intake scoop was removed. He fabricated a new scoop using reshaped panels from a wrecked P-47. He lined the inner duct with thin copper guides, barely thicker than a matchstick, to prevent laminar flow separation. The end result looked crude, like something made in a shed, not a factory. But when 4163L took off again, she didn't gasp. She roared, and for the first time in months, she didn't stall out at 15,000. She reached 25,000 and kept going. That was before the jet chase, before the attention, before the disbelief. It started with one bird, one wrench, and one man who refused to let old machines fade into silence. The battlefield doesn't care about theories, it runs on numbers. And for aircraft, especially at high altitudes, numbers are everything. Feet per minute, pounds per square inch, degrees of heat, seconds of delay. Before Harding's intake mod, the numbers were bleeding pilots dry. Start with the basics. The stock air intake on the late model P-51 was designed to perform within a narrow band, optimal around 10,000 to 18,000 feet, with steady pressure flow designed for piston efficiency. But as the war pushed missions higher, longer, and faster, that intake became a bottleneck. Real-world data from squadron flight logs revealed the truth. At 20,000 feet, the average manifold pressure dropped by 18%. Engine RPM at climb rate decreased by 12 to 14% over 3 sorties without overhaul. Internal engine temperatures spiked by as much as 37 degrees during full throttle climb, often forcing early throttle downs just to avoid overheating. This meant fewer interceptions, longer approach times, and catastrophic combat delay. Worse, intake drag, the invisible killer, robbed aircraft of climb performance. How? When airflow gets turbulent inside the intake duct, it no longer delivers high-density oxygen to the combustion chamber. You get starvation, a rich fuel mix with not enough air. The engine chokes, temperatures rise, power fades. For every 10% airflow loss, a fighter could lose up to 400 feet per minute in climb. That might not sound like much, until you remember how fast enemies close at altitude. Example, Fighter A, stock intake, climbs at 2,800 feet on fit min at 12,000 feet. Fighter B, boosted airflow intake, climbs at 3,200 feet min. Over a 1-minute window, Fighter B gains 400 feet of altitude, enough to secure visual advantage, enter firing range first, or force an enemy into a dive. That 400 feet isn't just space, it's life. Now bring in the boost scoop numbers. Harding's retrofit, which rerouted airflow through a custom diverging throat and redirected turbulence with angled baffles, delivered staggering field improvements, plus 35% volumetric airflow recovery at altitudes over 18,000 feet. Reduction of 19° in peak engine temps at full climb throttle. Climb rate increase of 520 footmen tested across 4 modified aircraft. But the most shocking number, mission readiness. Aircraft equipped with the new intake had a 42% higher sortie availability rate compared to standard fleet averages during the final month of the European Air War. Why? Because they didn't overheat, they didn't choke at altitude, and they didn't require constant teardown between flights. The intake worked with the engine, not against it. It's easy to forget how much aviation performance hinges on air before the engine even gets it. You can have the best propeller, the strongest pistons, the cleanest fuel. But if the intake design isn't feeding it clean, compressed, laminar airflow, you're flying with a clogged throat. That was Harding's insight. He didn't invent power, he unlocked it. And in doing so, he dismantled the myth that only jets can win the speed game. In the math of war, seconds decide survival. Harding's mod shaved seconds off climbs, added seconds to intercepts, and gave pilots something even more valuable than speed: time. It began with a whisper in the hangar. A half-joke passed between tired crewmen. You hear Harding's building an intake out of scrap again. But when the tent flaps lifted, and they saw what he was doing, the laughter died. Tech Sgt. Marcus Harding wasn't modifying just any plane. He was operating on 4163L, the struggling bird, as if he were performing open-heart surgery. With the official maintenance log closed for the night and no officers on the deck, Harding and 2 trusted mechanics rolled the aircraft into Bay 3. They didn't have approval. They didn't need it. The plane had already been scheduled for decommissioning if performance didn't improve. It was now or never. The job began with disassembly. The entire intake scoop was cut out using angle grinders and saws not meant for aircraft work. Sparks flew. Smoke drifted. But Harding's hands were steady. Every rivet drilled, every weld broken, was done with a vision only he could see. Then came the improvisation. He shaped a new intake lip using aluminum ribs from a wrecked escort tank. The tapering duct was built from repurposed coolant vent shrouds from a destroyed B-24. For the baffle system, Harding used copper tubes bent by hand over a heated oil drum, forming guide vanes to redirect turbulent flow into a smooth channel. They worked for 48 hours without sleep. The floor was slick with oil and sweat. Every part was double-checked, every weld pressure tested with an improvised vacuum gauge. The modified intake didn't look pretty. It looked dangerous. Like something built to explode on takeoff, one crewman muttered. Harding wiped his hands. No, it's built to breathe. They bolted the new scoop under the cowling at 3:15 a.m., just as dawn turned the sky gray. The next step was the riskiest: test flight. Lieutenant Harper volunteered. He strapped in, fired the engine, and gave a quick thumbs up. The plane didn't rumble. It roared. Not louder, but sharper. The sound was tighter, more focused. Harding's team watched as the bird taxied, then took off. What happened next became legend on that airstrip. Harper hit 10,000 feet in record time, then 18,000, then 25,000. No choke, no flutter, no warning lights. Just raw, stable power. In the debrief, he pulled off his helmet wide-eyed. That thing climbs like it's got something to prove. The telemetry confirmed it. 32% faster to altitude. Lower engine stress readings across all ranges. Manifold pressure consistent at over 22 nhg at 26,000 feet. Something stock intakes hadn't seen in weeks. Within hours, whispers turned to demands. 3 more pilots requested the mod. One brought Harding a busted wing panel and asked, "Can you make my bird breathe like hers?" Command heard the noise. They asked questions. Harding gave no answers. Because this wasn't just a field test anymore. It was a revolution, hammer by hammer, tube by tube, and it had taken just 48 hours. When Harding's intake mod first flew, no one expected a miracle. At best, maybe the bird would last a few more sorties before limping back to depot. But the numbers coming in weren't suggesting survival. They pointed to dominance. It began with intercept math. In traditional piston versus jet engagements, the equation was brutally one-sided. Jets had higher thrust-to-weight ratios, superior acceleration, and could dictate the terms of every encounter. Piston planes couldn't chase. They reacted. And usually too late. The math was cruel. A standard Mi-262 could climb at 3,900 feet min. A stock P-51 with degraded intake, around 2,300 feet min. That's a 1,600 feet min gap. The difference between intercepting a bomber or watching it burn. But when 4163L flew with the modified intake, her climb rate hit 3,020 feet min. Not equal, but close enough to close distance with anticipation, not desperation. That changed everything. Fighter Command logged the first test dogfight on May 12th. The mission was escort duty, high altitude, over contested airspace. Enemy jets were spotted closing fast on a returning B-24 formation. Normally, pilots would dive to escape. This time, 4163L and 2 other modified Mustangs climbed. The intercept window opened. Instead of trailing by 800 feet at contact, they were above the jets when the merge occurred. That's air superiority math, and the kill went to 4163L. After-action logs noted, first climb to intercept success in 2 weeks. 0 engine overheat warnings during full throttle operation at 27,000 feet. Fuel efficiency remained within tolerance, proving the intake did not compromise range. But it wasn't just performance, it was morale. Mechanics on the line started calling the plane Slipstream 1. Not officially, not in paperwork, but in whispers. Other squadrons requested the scoop design. Some tried copying it with mixed results. Harding had spent weeks perfecting the pressure curves by feel. Others lacked that instinct. Still, results poured in. Sortie completion rate increased by 38%. Abort rate dropped by 42% due to intake-related engine strain. Average climb-to-target time was reduced by over a minute. A lifetime in dogfight terms. One pilot summed it up best. "I don't need to outrun a jet, I just need to meet it head-on with my guns already pointed." The math had collapsed. Not by a factory overhaul, not by government innovation, but by one wrench, one mechanic, and one line of pressure readings scratched on a coffee-stained clipboard. Harding hadn't made the best fighter. He'd made the old ones matter again. May 14, 1945, Eastern Austria. The war was nearing its end, but the skies were still lethal. At 10:38 a.m., a flight of B-24 bombers, returning from a deep strike into enemy infrastructure, called in a distress signal. 2 Arado 234s, German jet bombers, were spotted on a closing intercept course high and fast from the northeast. Escort coverage was thinning. Traditional protocol: dive, evade, and pray. But on this mission, the response wasn't fear. It was interception. From the clouds above, 3 P-51s descended. Not standard escorts, but Harding's modified aircraft. Among them, 4163L, piloted by Lieutenant Harper. This wasn't a random deployment. Flight logs later confirmed the modified fighters had intentionally flown a higher patrol pattern, something nearly impossible just a week earlier with their stock intake designs. Now, thanks to the upgraded airflow system, they could loiter above the bombers, then dive with superior positioning. Harper radioed in, calm but sharp. "Control, slipstream flight is descending. We've got the angle." The enemy jets didn't expect an attack. Why would they? No piston fighter had met them at equal altitude in weeks. But as the Mustangs dove, powered not by speed alone, but by gravity and hard-earned airflow efficiency, the equation shifted. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. Harper's 4-1 6-3L opened fire first, scoring direct hits on the lead Arado's port engine. Black smoke curled behind the jet, and it peeled away, diving low and out of the fight. The second Arado broke right, straight into the path of the second Mustang. More rounds, more damage, and another kill recorded. The bombers flew home untouched. Ground control couldn't believe it. 2 confirmed jet kills at altitude by aircraft that just 2 weeks prior were considered unfit for duty. The post-mission report was blunt. Slipstream flight engaged from a position previously unavailable to prop escorts. Enemy surprised. Outcome: total dominance. But what the report didn't capture was the reaction back at base. As the Mustangs landed, mechanics lined the tarmac. Not in ceremony, but in awe. The modified intakes were stained with soot, edges singed from the friction of altitude and velocity. But they held. The airflow held. The planes came back strong. Harding stood quietly at the edge of the flight line. No salute, no speech. Just eyes fixed on the cowling of 40163L as it rolled to a stop. Someone clapped him on the back. "You know," one of the officers muttered, "you may have just turned piston fighters into jet hunters." Harding didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound of the modified engine cooling down, the ticking, popping heat contraction of a plane that had outrun extinction, said everything. It was the sound of relevance, returned. Word travels fast in war. Faster than approval memos, faster than regulations. And when fighters start dropping jets from the sky with hardware built in a maintenance tent, commanders start asking questions. Not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Who authorized this? By late May, the intake modification was no longer a secret. Harding's original scoop design had already been copied. Not officially, but passionately. Crews across the region began mimicking his ductwork using whatever materials they could salvage. Tin from fuel drums, vanes cut from downed aircraft, even radio chassis used for flow redirection. In the 3rd Tactical Air Wing alone, 7 aircraft had been modified within 4 days of the first confirmed jet kill. Some copied his angles precisely. Others introduced their own flair. One mechanic installed a double-throat intake that gave impressive speed, but cooked the engine after 5 minutes. Trial and error became gospel. But while the mechanics innovated, the brass hesitated. A memo from Engineering Command labeled the mods non-standard alterations not recommended for continued use. Another report questioned the structural integrity of Harding's design. Unverified intake geometry could destabilize high-speed airflow, increasing risk of backfire or flameout. Harding responded with a dry note. Or we could keep dying. Still, the pressure to conform remained. One squadron commander threatened to ground all modified birds unless formal schematics were submitted. Harding refused. "I don't have schematics," he said. "I have results." Meanwhile, performance logs kept climbing. Average kill ratio of modified fighters doubled in 10 days. Average sortie duration increased by 22%, thanks to cooler running temps and improved altitude hold. Jet engagements that once ended in retreat now turned into running dogfights, and the Mustangs weren't losing. A pilot named Lieutenant Delgado, flying a modified P-51 dubbed Black Lung, recorded the first mid-altitude reversal. He baited a German jet into a shallow climb, then used superior cornering at altitude to flip the fight and score a rearward kill. When he landed, The jet's canopy fragment was still embedded in his wing root. That evening, Delgado scrawled one line onto the chalkboard above the crew shack. "Don't ask if it's legal. Ask if it works." Harding never liked that phrase. To him, it wasn't rebellion. It was responsibility. Planes were dying. Pilots were dying. If you had a solution and didn't act on it, you weren't following rules. You were hiding behind them. But not everyone agreed. On May 26th, orders came down. All intake modifications would be halted pending review. Field mod logs were to be submitted. Engineering Command wanted oversight. Too late. By then, 21 aircraft had already received the scoop. 3 more were in progress. And in the skies above, for the first time in years, propeller-driven planes were flying with the confidence of machines reborn. Not because of doctrine, but because of defiance. Harding didn't want credit. He wanted airflow. And for a brief, glorious window in history, he got it. History rarely remembers the mechanic. Medals go to aces, to generals, to heroes who lead charges or make speeches. But the truth is, without men like Harding, those heroes don't even get off the ground. In the final 2 weeks of May 1945, Allied prop fighters achieved a record 14 successful engagements against German jets, not because of improved tactics, not because of radar, but because of climb. Because they could finally meet the enemy where the battle started, in the air. The intake mod, once dismissed as heresy, became quiet legend. No, it was never formally adopted. No, the blueprints never made it to Washington. But its influence echoed across hangars, whispered in workshops, etched in the margin notes of post-war engineering manuals. Harding's design didn't end the war, but it shifted the sky, even if just for a moment. His real achievement wasn't the scoop itself. It was what it represented. A rejection of passive maintenance, a declaration that innovation doesn't need permission. That field mechanics forced to improvise with broken parts and broken rules often solve problems labs won't touch. In a debrief weeks later, a senior engineer remarked, "This design violates 3 sections of the field manual." To which Harding, standing beside the scorched intake, replied, "So does losing." After the war, 4163L was decommissioned. Her intake mod removed, replaced with standard parts before being flown to a storage base and eventually scrapped. No one marked the scoop as special. No one kept the modified baffles. But for the pilots who flew her, she was more than a plane. She was proof. Proof that innovation isn't always born in factories. That victory sometimes comes not from the sky, but from the shadows of the hangar. That one mechanic, armed with nothing but scraps and stubbornness, can outpace a machine worth 90 million and rewrite the rules from under the wing. If you walk through the rusting rows of aircraft in any forgotten airfield or museum graveyard, you might find her, or one like her. No markings, no ceremony, just another old warbird stripped of her paint and memory. You won't see the scoop. That was cut away. You won't find Harding's signature. He never left one. But somewhere beneath the riveted skin and oil-stained panels lingers the legacy of a mechanic who refused to wait for permission. Harding never made headlines. His name never showed up in post-war engineering journals. But pilots whispered about him. Crewmen tried to replicate his work. And to this day, his intake remains one of the most daring field-engineered performance boosts ever tested in live combat. This was never about breaking records. It was about survival. About giving one more edge to a pilot trying to make it home. About giving life back to a machine that had been written off. About believing that knowledge doesn't need a uniform, and solutions don't need to be approved. In a war defined by machines, Marcus Harding reminded everyone that sometimes the real breakthrough isn't designed in a lab. It's welded in a tent, bent over in the cold, formed from a trash pile, forged with risk. And when that engine roared to life, when the junk scoop outran a modern jet, it wasn't just a win for engineering. It was a win for belief. For every wrench in every hand that dared to think, "I can make this better." Harding did. And the sky